good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may find yourself on this beautiful Thursday. Why is it a beautiful Thursday? Well, college football is upon us, and this is the debut episode of Ball with Y'all. Before we get into the sports, I just want to express my extreme gratitude for the support we've received since releasing our trailer about a week ago. From coast to coast, from California to Florida, New York, and so on, we've got fans across the nation, and you're all excited about something that we've put together in this format, and I'm really excited to join alongside you all in this capacity as we go on throughout the season. Now, we've got a lot to talk about today, and in fact, I've said we a lot. And I think it's important that I discuss who we are as Ball with Y'all. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sean. I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. Moved down to South Florida about 10 or 12 years ago. Just got to be transparent here. I am an Alabama fan. My mom is an Alabama fan. My dad was an Auburn fan. Luckily, I chose with the right team. And I've won 6 national championships ever since. But I just want to get that out there. You know, I'm not going to be biased on this. Well, I'm going to try not to be biased. But I really love college sports. And I've loved to see the value that is associated with college sports in the South, especially. Also, this is all put together by my executive producer, Daniel. He's actually my great friend. We've gone back for, I don't know, ever since I was in 6th grade or so. So it's incredible to work alongside him in this capacity. And he really is the core of our production here. We have a loaded show on tap for you today. We're going to go into some summer headlines. This is our first show since many of the major headlines came out over the summer. So we'll discuss some of that. We'll go into our picks for the week, as well as our predictions for this upcoming football season. Some of those predictions might surprise you. They kind of surprised myself sometimes when I was putting them together, and they definitely surprised Daniel when he was putting together the show notes for this. So make sure you listen to that later on as well. Of course, we're nearing the end of summer, and it's definitely been a wild one in the SEC and across the college football landscape overall. Before we dive into the slate of games this weekend, I do feel it's important to at least touch upon the elephant in the room. Oklahoma, Texas, and the Alliance. If you don't know already, Oklahoma and Texas are coming to the SEC. Could be as late as July 2025, could be as early as next season. And this is for all sports. They'll be joining the SEC. It was announced late July during SEC Media Days. And it's going to have a number of ramifications. We don't really know what's going to happen from a scheduling standpoint. We don't know, will we have some realignment as far as who's in what division? Do Alabama and Auburn get pushed from the west to the east? Do we go to 4 pods of 4 teams? How does it affect the number of conference games per year? And I think there's a lot of concern and there's a lot of unknown. You listened last week to Paul Feinbaum when he was talking to Greg Sankey, SEC commissioner. He didn't really have a whole lot of answers either. And every single time anybody's really been asked about what scheduling looks like moving forward, whether that's next season or in 2025 or whatever else the case may be, no one really knows. It's exciting to have Oklahoma and Texas join the conference, and it seems like it's going to benefit all parties, both those within the SEC and on the outside as well, from a profit standpoint, from a name brand standpoint, from a notability standpoint, and also from the opportunity when it comes to the playoff. If the playoff does end up getting expanded from the current 4-team structure, you have to imagine having Oklahoma, Texas, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Auburn, so many other teams, LSU, A&M, if I didn't already mention them, they all have the opportunity to get in there, and you could have as many as 3, 4, 5, 6 SEC teams in there. So it kind of makes sense how other conferences may not necessarily love the decision that Greg Sankey made by moving forward with it. Of course, Greg Sankey has received a great deal of pushback as a result of adding on Oklahoma and Texas. Some commissioners have made some indirect comments about their displeasure with the move, and of course that came out in the most recent update. That was the Alliance. The Alliance. I don't even know where to begin with this. Well, first off, what is the Alliance? It's a handshake agreement with the Big Ten between the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and the ACC. They don't have a formal contract, and I feel like that's more so just because they don't want to get into any legal trouble. But it's this weird decision where basically they want to, and it almost came across as though a retaliation against the SEC, where they saw it as, well, the SEC has so much power now with so many name brands in college football. We need to do something to protect ourselves. Of course, no one's directly said that. I'll read you a couple quotes here. This is ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips. He said, quote, "In the history of college athletics, one expansion of a conference has usually led to another, and to another. And to the three of us, we felt the stabilization of the current environment across Division I and FBS, in Power 5 in particular. This was a chance for a new direction, a new initiative that I don't think has ever been done before." Pac-12 Commissioner Greg Kliakoff echoed this sentiment when he said, "The goal of the alliance is to get to a place where every single school in the conference is playing 8 conference games, 1 home game, and 1 away game against the other 2 conferences." So essentially, this comes down to a scheduling thing. They know that every single week, Alabama could play Texas, they could play Oklahoma, they could play Georgia, they could play Arkansas, they could play A&M, they could play Florida, they could play LSU, a number of teams that are notable and draw attention. I think if you're in the Big Ten, you're Ohio State, you don't really want to play the Rutgers and the Marylands and the, especially after this past weekend, Nebraska's of the world, when you could fill your schedule with a name brand like an Oregon or a Clemson or even a Florida State. So I understand it from that standpoint, but the problem becomes, and I think you also heard this last week if you caught when Miami AD, the Miami athletic director, was on the Paul Feinbaum show, and he mentioned that they don't really have any openings when it comes to non-conference scheduling right now. So the other side of it is, do you even have any room for flexibility right now? And is this something that the alliance can't really even be instituted from a scheduling standpoint for another 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years? So it really doesn't seem like it accomplished a whole lot. The only threat that the alliance might pose is that it kind of shifts the power on certain issues. You think about, if say, for example, they want to limit the number of scholarships that a team might be able to have at their expense in a conference. Well, if it's a voting thing, now you have three conferences all supporting one idea. You have the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Pac-12 against the SEC. The SEC doesn't have a lot to say at this point, but I don't really know how much that's going to come into play, because even now you see how just the other day, UCLA and or USC rather, and LSU just announced a neutral site game taking place in Las Vegas in a couple years. That's not part of the alliance. That's not part of the scheduling agreement. And let alone, what about the Big 12? I guess we're not worried about them. We're not worried about those 8 remaining teams, the TCUs, the West Virginias, Baylors, and so on. This alliance that supposedly is concerned about the long-standing longevity of college football doesn't really seem to be concerned about the longevity of college football as a whole. But again, it maybe just came across more so as a retaliation, if you will. The other thing about the alliance is that it seems to delay the progression of college football playoff expansion. In fact, last week, Gordon Gee, the West Virginia president, he's been around, he was at, I believe, Brown, Ohio State, and other places. He said that the College Football Playoff Expansion Committee, right now, their proposal for a 12-team playoff is on life support. It doesn't sound like these teams are really, or these conferences are supporting it now. And it's funny because just a few months ago they did, and then all of a sudden Oklahoma and Texas end up in the SEC, and for whatever reason, they don't really seem to support the notion of expanding the playoff. And really, the only people who are hurting most by that are those conferences, because they don't get the additional revenue. Of course, part of it is having to work out agreements with ESPN and Fox. I mean, first off, the ACC network is an ESPN product. The Big Ten and the Pac-12, they're both associated with Fox predominantly, so now there's competing powers on that front from a network standpoint. So you can already tell there's some fault lines underneath this alliance, but we'll see how that unfolds. Of course, there's a lot that remains to be seen. Let's go ahead and shift to this week. We've got a lot to cover, and I don't want to belabor the point too much about this past summer. Last night we had UAB and Jacksonville State kick off the action. So incredible to see. Football is back, of course. Ohio State and Minnesota play tonight. Josh Heupel kicks off his career as the Volunteers head coach down up in Tennessee against Bowling Green. So we've got a lot on tap tonight. But let's talk about the 6 biggest games taking place this weekend and who I expect to win. First off, we'll go with Clemson and Georgia, a neutral site game taking place in Charlotte. Clemson is a 3-point favorite right now. The over-under on total points is around 51.5. This is the first meeting between the two teams since 2014, and Georgia won that game. That was in Athens. But Georgia's dealing with a ton of injuries right now, and they're not just nobodies. They're pretty notable injuries, and it makes it seem as though it's going to be a defensive battle. So as a result, I'd expect that number, that over and under, 51.5, probably to hit the under on that one. Georgia quarterback is getting a ton of hype right now. JT Daniels, of course, he's a transfer from USC. But I do want to pump the brakes a little bit on that. JT Daniels, he got a bunch of hype last year toward the end of the 2020 season. The average defensive ranking of the teams that he was playing, I believe the average ranking was around 86th overall. So those defenses were not strong. Yes, he beat Cincinnati. Great, cool. How do they compare to an SEC defense? Right? I don't really know how much I buy into that hype. Alternatively, if you look at the Clemson side of the ball, there's a lot of unknown. Much like a number of teams across the country, we don't really know what to expect from them offensively. Of course, we saw 1 or 2 games, a little, bits and pieces of the new quarterback last year, especially when Trevor Lawrence went down, but we don't really know what to expect from that front either. So if you take the unknown versus the injuries, I'll take the unknown just because you never know what might happen. I'll go Clemson in a tight one, 24-20. Go with the under on that 51.5. Moving on down to Atlanta, a 3:30 kick on, I believe, ABC. Miami will be playing Alabama. Alabama is an 18.5-point favorite, and the over-under on that one is 62 overall total points. This is the first meeting between the two teams since their national championship showdown in 1993, which Alabama won, of course. Bama is significantly stronger on defense than they've been in years. I would say this is probably the best defensive unit that they've had since maybe that 2015-2016 range, where they went on that series of games where they had non-offensive touchdowns. And they have a ton of talent. They're so deep. Looking at that depth chart, they have talent across the board, but the problem is they're super young. If I remember correctly, they're one of the youngest teams out there right now, and that's going to translate in inexperience. That inexperience, especially in big games like this, is going to hurt them. The flip side of it is, though, defense is also probably Miami's strength. So, especially if you consider De'Aaron King, the quarterback from Miami. I actually got to see him at the Cheez-It Bowl back in Orlando in December. Yep, late December. That was the game where I believe he tore his ACL, his MCL. I don't know. It was a gruesome knee injury, and he's coming off that. You don't really know what to expect from him. Of course, mobile quarterbacks, they cause a problem for Alabama, historically speaking. Think of the Cam Newtons, the Johnny Manziels, and so on. But I just don't think that Miami has enough offensively to overcome Alabama. However, I definitely think the 18.5 is way too high. Until Alabama starts clicking offensively with new running back, new wide receivers, new quarterback, several new members of the offensive line, 18.5 is just far too high for me. I'll go Alabama 34-24 with Miami covering and the under 62 hitting. Over to LSU and UCLA. This game is taking place in the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, so at UCLA's home site. LSU is a 3.5-point favorite with a 66 over-under. This is the first ever matchup between the two schools. If we saw anything in week 0, we saw that UCLA's strength is their running game. And also the dual threat quarterback, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, also poses a pretty prominent challenge for the Tigers this year. On the other side, for the Tigers, last year's defense wasn't really a strength for them. Looking at former defensive coordinator Bo Pelini, they gave up 5 games of more than 40 points, and they had 6 games where they allowed at least 500 yards. I mean, you think about, they only played 10 games last year. So that's pretty abysmal. Of course, now that we're post-Pelini, you imagine the defense will probably be markedly better. And I guess to that point, LSU showed signs of life offensively toward the end of the season. So I'll go LSU simply outscoring UCLA. I don't say they're not gonna defensively beat LSU, or UCLA. I'll say that they outscore UCLA. Let's go 38-31 LSU, and that also means the over would hit on the 66. Looking at Louisville, Ole Miss. That's a Labor Day game, actually, in Atlanta. Ole Miss is a 9.5 point favorite. Over-under sitting at 75.5. I just got to say, I am terrified of Ole Miss. As an Alabama fan, I am terrified. And I'm really high on them this year. I think Lane Kiffin is doing incredible things. Of course, I'm just down the road from Florida Atlantic University, down here in South Florida. I saw the incredible things he did here. And now I believe he's in, year 2, year 3? Kiffin, he captures something offensively, and I just don't... defenses cannot stop him. You look at last year, Matt Corral, the quarterback. He had flashes of brilliance as a result of that. The only problem is if he made a lot of mistakes. But if he's improved his decision making over the summer, Ole Miss will absolutely be dangerous. Luckily for Ole Miss, Louisville's quarterback Malik Cunningham, he also makes a lot of mistakes. Last year he had 12 interceptions and numerous fumbles. As a result of that, I imagine Ole Miss will dominate the line of scrimmage, and ultimately they'll just make less mistakes to win the game. I'll go Ole Miss 48-27. Moving on to Penn State, Wisconsin. This is a in-conference season opener happening up in Wisconsin. Home game for Wisconsin. 4.5 point favorite are the Badgers. Over-under sitting around 50. Wisconsin's defense will probably be much stronger than many other teams they'll play this year. Will probably end up being a top 10 defense. Penn State, of course, is bringing in a new offensive coordinator, Mike Yurcich. And this poses a good opportunity for the Nittany Lions, and it probably will be a beacon of hope moving forward. But this new offense isn't exactly the most ideal environment to start off against in a hostile Badgers defense that will just be coming for them. Wisconsin's offense, comparatively, they're led by a second-year starter in Graham Mertz. This offensive stability for the Badgers, alongside pretty prominent defensive prowess for the Badgers, will get them a hard-earned W. I'll go 2013 Wisconsin. Moving on down to Austin, Texas, where Louisiana Lafayette will be taking on the Texas Longhorns. Texas is an 8-point favorite. The over-under is sitting at 58 points. This is the opening game, the first game ever for head coach Steve Sarkisian. He is kicking off his Texas career with quite a challenge. This is the third matchup between the schools ever, and for Louisiana head coach Billy Napier, who is a former Saban assistant, he has a talented team yet again. Offensively, Louisiana is stacked, and they're led by 3-year starter Levi Lewis at quarterback. Of course, there's a ton of returning talent for the Longhorns as well, but they're starting a redshirt freshman at quarterback, and that just might be the difference. I'll go Louisiana Lafayette in an upset, 34-30. Moving on to some season predictions. There's a lot to unpack here, and honestly, part of this hurt me just putting this together, but we'll get into it. First off, I don't expect Alabama to win the national championship this year. Let's first talk about why that is. If you look at the last 17 years, only 2 preseason number 1 teams eventually won the AP national title. That was Alabama in 2017, which, if you remember, that team had its fair share of adversity as well. They ended up having to switch their quarterback at halftime of the national championship game. And USC in 2004. Of course, Alabama's the number 1 team right now in the nation, and I can't argue with history. I just don't see it. So if it's not Alabama, who wins the national championship this year? Who takes it home, right? If you look historically, again, I love numbers, probably it's going to be somebody ranked in the AP preseason top 7. Since 2004, every national champion has been ranked in the top 7 except for 2 teams. Auburn in 2010, led by Cam Newton, and Florida State in 2013, led by Jameis Winston. So let's look at the top 7 teams. Of course, you got Alabama, Oklahoma, Clemson, Ohio State, Georgia, Texas A&M, Iowa State, so on. Listen, I love Iowa State. I really do. I love Matt Campbell. I think they've got a lot of great things going on. I just couldn't pick them to win their conference, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So I'll pass. There's a lot of hype on A&M right now, and I don't quite get it. I just don't understand. You know, they're also starting what I believe is a freshman quarterback. And yes, they're a talented team. Jimbo always does a great job in recruiting down there for the Aggies, but I just don't see it this year. So I'll pass on A&M as well. Then you got, of course, Georgia, Clemson, Oklahoma, Ohio State, or potentially a sleeper team. Listen, Kirby Smart, Georgia head coach, he has so much pressure on him. If you look at his record and you compare it to Mark Richt, who was a former Georgia coach right before he showed up, eerily similar, and very little to show do the Bulldogs have for these most recent years. And if you're a Georgia fan, you have to wonder what is the expectation here? Because very soon it's getting to the point where why did we even get rid of Mark Richt? Of course, I understand now, hindsight is 2020, but at what point has Kirby reached his ceiling? And I just don't see him getting it this year either. So we'll just keep moving forward. Ohio State, love them, great team. Well, I don't love them, but, still a great team nonetheless. I don't really see them pulling it off this year. Of course, they made a great run to the championship game last year. Clemson, like I said, a lot of unknown. I actually don't have them winning their conference. Let's talk into that right now. That's a good segue. Conference champions. Before I tell you who I have in my Final Four, let's go into the conference champions. I've got in the ACC, North Carolina. The North Carolina Tar Heels led by Mack Brown. I'm really high on Mack Brown this year. I think he's got something special with quarterback Sam Howell. It's going to be great. In the Big 12, I know I mentioned I wanted to pull off Iowa State. I'm going Oklahoma to win their conference, the Big 12, while they're still in it for now. In the Big 10, while I don't see Ohio State win the championship, I do see them winning their conference. Ohio State in the Big 10. The Pac-12, I've got the Arizona State Sun Devils, led by Herm Edwards. See them pulling it off. The Pac-12 is probably the most wide open conference out there right now. And I think ultimately speaking, Arizona State will pull it off and win the Pac-12. Lastly, in the SEC, I mentioned I don't see Alabama winning the championship. And honestly, I don't see them winning the conference this year either. But if I don't see Alabama winning the conference, who is it? Right? You think Florida, you think A&M, LSU. Nope. While I don't think Kirby will win the national championship, I wouldn't be surprised if he pulled off yet another conference championship. I'll go Georgia to win the SEC this year. So, of those 5 conference champions, I'll pick 4 of them to make the playoff. I'll go North Carolina, Georgia, Oklahoma, Ohio State. Just looking at the geographics here, I'd imagine Georgia and North Carolina would play, and Oklahoma and Ohio State would play. I'll go Oklahoma over Ohio State, Georgia over North Carolina, and then finally, your 2020, I guess that would be 2022? 2021, 2022? For the 2021-22 season, I have the Oklahoma Sooners winning the national championship with Spencer Rattler at quarterback. He'll probably end up winning the Heisman, honestly. So that's what we're looking at. We've got a crazy season ahead of us, a crazy week ahead of us. You already know there's going to be at least one upset this weekend. Hopefully it's not the Crimson Tide. I'd love to not start off with a loss. But we're going to be talking about it on Monday, so I hope you're ready for a wild weekend. And make sure that you also check the description wherever you're listening. We have a little line down there if you'd like to send us a voice message. Tell us your take, especially what I'm sure will be a wild weekend. Hopefully you also have a lot to say. We'd love to hear from you. And that's all we've got for the first episode here with Ball with Y'all. Thank you for sticking around. How's it feel? Thank you so much. It's so awesome to be here and just talk sports, man. It's college football season. Just a reminder, we've got Clemson, Alabama, LSU, Ole Miss, Wisconsin, and Louisiana Lafayette winning all the big games this weekend. Ultimately speaking, Oklahoma win the championship. I'm sure that CFP Final Four will change throughout the season. Looking forward to a full season with you all. Enjoy the games this weekend, and we'll talk on Monday.